thanking for this very moment that we got together to remember once more the message of Jesus. So once more, our thanks for your presence here. It makes a huge difference to us when we are together. And we can feel this warmth and this feeling. Our thanks for all of you being here. We'd like to remember you all that you should bring your water, and there will be passes at the end, collective passes at the end, where we receive the same treatment from the benefactor spirits, from the spiritual realm that help us and keep us balanced. We'd like to remind you all that we have gospel for children starting next Saturday. It will be online initially. So if you have children and you would like to enroll them, and you just talk to, you have to fulfill some forms and so forth. There will be some plays and so forth to introduce the concepts of Jesus. There will be some hands-on experience too. If you have children or grandsons, you should consider bringing them. One more opportunity that we're opening to bring back the activities of the house. And our classes for study will also be open next Thursday. There are also classes in English on Wednesdays. 7 p.m. Also be online.
A nossa livraria está aberta, temos ainda algumas marmitinhas, algumas to go, né, para o nosso dia a dia, uma variedade. Então, essa é uma forma que nós encontramos de ajudar a manutenção das casas, fazendo comida para as pessoas levarem para a semana. Comida congelada, né, que a gente mesmo faz.
She's also talking about some of the activities of the house around the books, which also exist in English, and other ways to help the institution. Recommendations for wearing the masks and social distancing. And today we are going to have, in a very special day, we're going to review a great friend of ours, son of my heart. And before we go there, we would like to open with a prayer so that we can harmonize ourselves with the spiritual world, spiritual realm, and find ourselves balanced. So we'll ask our friend that's online.
Pensando na alma, então nós vamos recolher,
So we are going to look inside ourselves, close our eyes, and allow all this harmony from this environment and peace can enter ourselves and our beings. We thank the spiritual friends of this house, benefactors, for their care with us. Thanking Jesus himself for his presence among us. And moved by this gratitude, we'll raise our thoughts to seek Jesus. And we're here gathered in your name to give continuity to our learning through the teachings of Jesus. Dear Lord Jesus, we want to thank you very much for this opportunity, for these moments, happy moments, where we seek the food for the soul, and we can be satiated through those learnings. In this moment, Jesus will ask of you, you can gather energy around our friend Marcelo, broaden his perception in your arms, yes, that you can involve him and use the word with all the care and beauty. And we thank you for the opportunity again, so we can give continuity to this morning, to these activities, to this meeting. Now we transfer this to Marcelo. We would like to add to him is that he is just a good friend of the house, a good friend of ours. And if we could have him every day. At this moment, he can to give us a little bit of help. We welcome our good friend Marcelo. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you all, to all the workers of this very special place in my heart, Cardiac Spirit Society of Massachusetts. I consider it to be an extension of the works that we do here. In truth, I feel this is the mother of the inspiration of many works that we try to accomplish here, and the connections of fraternity and friendship that we established many, many years, God knows how many years ago, and maybe just those are materializing now through this year, this time in the United States of America. We came here. The subject that we are going to talk about today, that we're going to try to cover in a very, very simple way, bringing some considerations about it, is relative to this food, this nourishment that fulfill all the souls, which is love. This love that goes way beyond the characteristics that we all imagine commonly. The transcendental love that goes beyond our ability of feeling and perceiving things, very materialized and very connected to the questions of reciprocity, but a love that we're going to try to bring. We're going to bring some paintings that we're still learning, very rudimentary, very far away from this love. We will, this love that feeds us, that nourishes us. And we're going to see that every time throughout humanity, every era, is highlighted by situations that are very specific, which end up showing up the development of the intellectual moral development of the human being. At the present time, we see an explosion of technology, of science, high tech, bringing us great ability of perceiving the material world. We've never been so far away, never been so close to so much knowledge. And this multitude, this finitude almost of the keeps growing exponentially because as knowledge opens something through science, other knowledge derived from it, from this very initial knowledge, and becomes, and it's a geometrical progression of this level of knowledge, intellectual knowledge that we are subjected to. All of this, without a question, brings us a little bit of disquiet, of anxiety, and we end up developing frustration, fear, uncertainty, and emptiness. Emptiness, existential emptiness. Because something really good should generate something good as well. But this amount of information that we are receiving every day brings us into frustration. And today, through a smartphone, we press a few buttons and we have access to news throughout the entire planet, good and bad. Man can communicate in a speed that's unimaginable. And today, we're having, for instance, a conversation. I'm here in Florida, and our friends are in Massachusetts, and we are connected through this virtual network. But there's also other elements that need to be considered because in this interconnection throughout the entire planet, we end up in many moments, if we are not very well centered, going in the wrong direction relative to the needs that the law of progress tells us that we need to bring, the social networks and the culture of the status quo of the have, this proposition of the hedonistic proposition of bring the questions relative to pleasure and with the material development, with the science development and the network connection, interconnections throughout the entire planet and also the major industries. There are too many possibilities for us to have and to be connected to show situations in which they not represent exactly our internal evolutionary moment. In this, we have this technological advance, but a bankruptcy of the spirit. We can put ourselves in a situation of hunger, of something beyond, of something that can show to us that our existence is way larger than the questions relative to the material world. The numbers relative to suicide show, we can verify recently some data that brings us some characteristics more so throughout September, which is the month considered to be of advertisement for the proposition of non-suicidal, which life has value. We can see the numbers around millions suffering of existential emptiness. And posthumous work from Allan Kardec in chapter 27. We have Allan Kardec brings us some throughout mediumistic writing from some friends of his, and in a message of 25 of April 1866, and those mediums brings us some information that I'm going to read for you. And it brings us the following. Very quickly, the, the things will happen very quickly. It's coming close to us, the times that we're going to say, the times are arriving. This is in 1866. And if it was not to happen so quickly, the destruction, the suicide will multiply themselves without unexpected scenarios. This will grow, the craziness will grow even among children, and it will reach so many men that even before they die, they will be cut from the number of death. The true signs of the time, those are really the real signs of the times, and this will happen because of the circumstances, as we have told you. Without there is not the slightest possibility of changing the laws of nature. This moment that we bring from a message from Paris in 25 of April 1866, this spirit tells us, Allan Kardec, the times that we are experiencing now, a hunger of something uh, that is something very material, love, sensual love, the love uh, from the questions at this level in which we are all find ourselves. Without a question, all of this relative to this existential emptiness, of this hunger of something that can fulfill us. Hunger, the thirst, the ambition of the things for right now have replaced the real values of the emotion. The questions connected to prayer, meditation, solidarity, of love and true care, as love to a neighbor, of this self-love is more than needed these days. It's interesting to see that in Gospel from John, chapter 16, on Jesus tells us that I have told you all of these things so that you can believe in me and so you can find peace in me. In the world, you always have affliction, but have good will, good faith. I won the world. The word that Jesus proposed to us that we win is not the material connected to the material world, well, although they're very important because the things connected to the material world are useful to us and needed to us for progress, because the law of progress tells us is one of the elements that are here according to the moral laws. It's the third part of the Spirit's book. But those things connected to materiality, they were not really the end. They are means for us to reach our destination. We know that we need to valorize them, to put value on them in a proportion, knowing that the me and the direction of the creature is not this level. In the world, you have afflictions, maybe the subject of the situations, in which I'm going to put it in a very colloquial way, we end up putting ourselves in that situation from previous lives and result in consequences these days from things that happened in the past. We're not very successful in the past. The book, The Destiny in Life, was chapter 26 from Leon Denis. He brings some of this subject to us relative to suffering. In this book, he tells us that this moment in which society is going through, the suffering is necessary so that we can slowly perceive that in these moments of sacrifice and fear and pain, we are molded, and these internal elements in which we are, we can notice the greatness of love. It seems paradoxical, but in reality, it talks about suffering. But in the previous chapter, it brings us the subjects relative to love. In this chapter 26, it tells us that we are still in the level in which we are. It is necessary the anguish and the suffering so that the soul can conquer its suavity, its beautiful moral beauty, so that it can wake up the feelings that are still asleep. It tells us this life that we all face, this uncomfortable life that we still experience, and I'm talking about that it's not necessary to suffer. The Spiritist doctrine is what happiness of peace and plenitude. But Leonard tells us that in these moments in which we're going through, that the prophets and the spirits prepared us to get there. They point to us that we are going to sow the crop that one day we spread in the past. In this process of learning, the pain, the suffering starts to be the the elements necessary to so that the being can develop itself for the superior world. So everything gets beauty from the suffering. And even through this life, he positions that. And this brings to me a something very beautiful because even in this life, some tenderness is comes from the faces drenched in tears, and these faces end up in developing this beauty, this majestic face, majestic way that brings peace to and tenderness to all of us. Because it's true that these souls that suffer, they suffer in a different way because we all experience pain and suffering and we curse against God. But those that learn throughout millennia that pain and suffering is a blast, according to gospel, for instance, tells us that pain is a blessing that comes to those who are elected. Do not suffer. Do not curse when you're suffering. On the contrary, rejoice on it because God tags you through pain on earth, so the glory in the sky. Jesus was telling us that this process of painful growth, in these moments in which we see the pandemic, invite us to some deep understanding, deep reflection on where we are. And we're not talking about where we are connected in our intimacy. Remember John, in the world you have afflictions. Maybe those are the afflictions. And maybe those afflictions that those two spirits that came from Allan Kardec in 1866 in posthumous works from Allan Kardec. Maybe this is one of the messages that can tell us the times in which we are experiencing. Without a question, having the opportunity to get a very careful examination of all of this, of the duty in which we have for ourselves, towards ourselves, and towards our neighbors, our next. This duty that's beyond life. As Lazarus tells us in chapter 17, be perfect. This duty that's very hard to be fulfilled sometimes because it invites us this internal duty that we carry within ourselves because it's the law of God and it doesn't belong to the spirit's movement of the spiritists. The law of God belongs to the being and it's at the spiritual principle because it exists in one's consciousness. So that as we develop ourselves, we can reach to it and learn and experience from it with our will and our free will, and we are able to administer it. And Manuel said to Chico Xavier, this well fulfilled duty doesn't have witnesses. These victories don't have witnesses, and they're not subjected to repressions when we failure to ourselves, when we fail this law that we carry within ourselves. Lazarus, the spirit, brings us this duty. Is our consciousness guarding us from our internal direction that from time to time assures that we're going to follow the path and don't go in the wrong direction, and we generate some situations which we are sowing something bad towards us, prepare ourselves for the glorious future. In these times of the pandemic, in this time of hunger, spiritual hunger of love, God has given us from the beginning all the same across the suffering, rich, instructed, poor. We all suffer for the same causes, and we are so that we are able to well judge the bad that we can do towards others. And that maybe this is one of the messages in which the destruction and suffering that we are experiencing, which means God will hurt mankind, is one of the questions of the Spirit's book, 737, if I'm not mistaken. And the good spirits tells us that these moments of destruction happen so that we can progress in a quick way. We told you that destruction is needed so that there is regeneration of moral spirits and reach new existence. We go one step higher in this step of perfection. And these are the words of the Spirit brings us. And right after that, Kardec asks once again, but I imagine Kardec scratching his head asking, could be another way so that we could, employ so the mankind can grow. I can imagine Kardec scratching his head and writing this question down, and it was spread over many mediums at the time, and he reconciled the answers from many different sources, and the answer is yes, yes. There are other means. Daily, divine providence applies all of these means, but many times, we don't pay attention to those, which is the love to our neighbors, to those that are around us, the knowledge of good and evil, being able to distinguish between the two and apply those in every moment in the small and big things, fulfilling with this duty, which is not outside, it's not written in the human laws, because the human laws slowly by slowly adjust to the divine law. But the laws in which are etched in our consciousness as the compass that guides us, the north of our own behavior as immortal spirits. And the love, when well observed, this duty towards ourselves and our kin, those that are around us, we bring to us and spread to us this tenderness and fulfills us as if it was something that we can nourish from, that fulfills us, that we no longer feel that we are pushed aside from the world. We are those that feel in this selfishness, because the selfishness is still the need for us to have things, afraid, the fear that we bring with us from the previous times, from the beginning of time, that was needed in the past, but now with the knowledge that we acquired through love and the knowledge that we acquired through the Spirit's doctrine, which shows us a different way, a different path, because the Spirit is immortal in many lives. As the Pastor Alves tells us, from the light of the Creator we came, many lives we experienced. For the same light we return. From a book from Parnaso de El Túmulo from Chico Xavier. Chico Xavier brings us this poetry from Castro Alves, who dictated to him, and tells us in this process of many experiences, many lives, we are slowly developing this love that will be the base in which the Spirit, the great building of the Spirit, can be one day be built and emerge from it, from its own humanity. The love, as such, as we understand on earth, is connected to the instincts, as we said, the impulses that guides us one towards the other without a question. But in reality, the love is is infinite in its facets and goes from the very vulgar ones to the most sublime ones. The atom is a um, beauty of love, and we see on that super particles connected, sending energy through all the electrons, negatives and positive charges, attracting themselves because those opposites attract themselves with something bigger, bringing at the very beginning the first forms of love, in which moment they can clothe themselves as beauty in the form of the human being that go towards the angelitude. And Nosso Lar, the book in chapter entitled Love, Nourishment for the Soul, and Eloise in the spiritual realm, and how Laura's house. Those who didn't read the book, I highly recommend it. He's telling, and Eloise is with this spirit, and he starts asking about this subject about the feeding. How would people eat? What is it that they were having? And uh, Donna Laura tells us a few considerations about Eloise, the spirit Laura, and I'm going to read a little portion of it. Laura, mother of Lysias, looking at how perplexed he was, and Louise was, relative to nourishment, he explains to him, our brother is not yet aware that the most basic element to support the human being is really love. Once in a while, we receive in our house great instructors that will teach us relative to the spiritual nourishment. In another subject that I bring, it's from the same book, I bring all the nourishment in various levels of life has love as the base of it all. And the physical nourishment, even though very well considered, is no more, no less than materialization, transitory materialization, as the vehicles on earth is necessary for the lubrication for it to roll. So the soul overall nourishes from love. As we go towards evolutionary moment in creation, we more and more understand this logic, this truth that love is what moves us. And it tells us that Lysias, the son of Laura in the spiritual world, tells us that everything is balanced in this infinite love of God. And the more evolved is the being, more subtle is that process of nourishment. Lysias tells us that the vermin from the soul eats from the eats from the earth itself, from the soil, but the birds and everything else goes developing itself and eating more and more subtle elements, so that ultimately what will bring us nourishment is love, as we don't yet understand. This is the great proposition that is in front of us. These in this moment of so much difficulty they experience. This love that we're talking about. This love with uppercase L is the base and the beginning of universal life that brings to us this most beautiful and pure intensities that in all its shades and expressions. This love that brings to us this infinite amount of energy and keeps renewing constantly. It gratifies us, gratifies those who give it. At the same time, it gratifies those who receive it. It's like a connection that's established with all the creatures that love in all the things that we have around us. We have many expressions of love without questions. We are probably at the very basic ones: the love of the mother, loves of a son, the love towards a country, the love towards a race, as if race was not the human race, without ethnicity and skin color, and the situations, so ephemeral situations in which we are subjected to. This love beyond us, as Lazarus, Spirit Lazarus tells us, it will make us all equal because we all suffer for the same reasons, being rich or poor, instructed or ignorant. We, we are all the same at that level, and that's where probably the message that the destructions that we experience, the pandemic that we're experiencing right now, it's maybe the message that we bring to us, and many of us probably are not perceiving it this way, but we can see a little bit beyond that. We can notice this. We can see that there is a message behind it. In Evolution in Two Worlds, chapter 18, André Luiz tells us that those who have already learned to love with God and they go straight forward, straight up towards virtue, and those who still suffer that they need to be loved by all shades and they still horizontally and still connected to the sensuality and materiality in the same subject, in the same book, chapter 18. And then Lewis tells us that in this conversation he's experiencing in front of a table with Lysias and other that were together with him, Lewis asks about the questions connected to sex, and sex is a manifestation of sacred manifestation of this divine love, but still is very isolated in this potential, infinite potential that every being carries within. And this magnetic connections that happens in the most spiritualized couples, the understanding, the love, without not only connected to, we're not taking apart the material perception, but those more spiritualized, they only need to just look at each other, touch, and they understand, and tenderness, so that the soul can be nourished of this love in the exchange, energetic exchange that is still not perceived by us. They are more afflicted and connected to the materiality. And the Consoler, question 323, Emmanuel tells us that an expression of sensuality, love at this very moment, in this moment of super sensuality that we're experiencing right now. Maybe this is the moment in which we are going through right now. It's all connected to sex in some ways, and invite us, and media just spreads that, and things. It's maybe this moment in which we are going through right now, and Emmanuel tells us these expression that love goes towards this super sexuality, always going, to find itself in the sublime experience of the spirituality, pure spiritual, by the renounce for the work of, so that we can develop this divine love which is given to the angels. That is the connection of God to fulfill God's designs, the plans for the universe. And this is one of the things that Emmanuel brings us in question 323 from the Consoler, the book Consoler. And that's why we perceive that there is a long path in front of us. But this long path, this long road ahead of us, shows that there is hope for the human being, for the creature, for all of us, because we are all in this road. And we can see in this moment in which we're going through, there are some who are different because they are much uh, bigger in terms of their love in this moments of sacrifice. And if God is infinite, sovereign, good, and just, if He has all of these attributes to the maximum scale, as we can see in Spirit's book, question 13, and we go through all the attributes of God, we're going to see that everything that God does is sovereign, good, and just. Because God Himself is justice and excellent, is He could not have created beings higher than others. There's no such a thing. We are all created simple and ignorant, and we follow through this many experiences in the body, and so we can develop ourselves in beauty and essence, the love. And in these souls, as we can see in chapter 26 of the problem of life and experience, we can see that through sacrifice towards the well-being of others, that we develop and we are etched and we are converted in this from this block of marble that we all are to become this beauty of that we can spread towards others around us. And life itself, its great proposition is love and to serve. There is, my friends, there is no other road. There is no other destination for the creature, for the human being, except love, which is much larger and stronger than hate, and much stronger than death, because death doesn't exist. If Christ was the largest of all the prophets, because he conquered himself this all these potentials, because he was not a great speaker, because he brought within himself this love in pure state, in maximum state. Because from the beginning of this planet, Jesus was creating the basis for the development, as Emmanuel tells us in chapter 1 of Towards the Light, the basis for this planet be the cradle of development for all of us. And we can grow, and one day we can convert ourselves in the pure expression of love, because there are mysteries of the destination for all of us, which tells us that we need to be rebirthed constantly, as the poet tells us. From this light of the Creator we came, many lives we experienced so that we can go back to that light. And it's coming towards us, this creature that slowly, within its limitations, goes fulfilling the thirst and nourish others, because sometimes we're nourished by others. We brought to us this message from Jesus, and we still reverberate this into our ears a proposition that goes beyond our ability of notice it. In the first letter from Paul to Corinthians, he tells us a few considerations relative to this love that was written in Greek, agape, he called the movement, that the Spirit brings to us as charity, carita, caritas, it's patient. This charity, this love in movement, it doesn't have envy, it's determined. It doesn't rush. It doesn't have selfishness. It doesn't take care of its own interest. It only takes the interest of the other. Doesn't doesn't degrade, doesn't suspect bad. How do we suspect poorly from others? It's still our evolutionary process. And Paul tells us that this same charity, this charity that this loving movement doesn't go well with injustice, but goes well with the truth. And he closes it, bringing us this more loving movement, this charity, this caritas, all bears, all believes, all waits, all suffers. What love is that Paul was talking about? That we're still so far away from conquer, that shakes us and brings to us the most internal feelings and makes us to go forward. And even though we cry sometimes because it's normal, more so these days, that we stop today and we meditate into ourselves sincerely and we ask for the necessary energy to move forward, I am sure that the bridge that would never, that always exists between us, the creature and creator, establishes itself again, and we are nourished by it through this love that tells us in our most intimate ears with these messages of, you will have afflictions, my sons, but have good will. I won against the world. It's not the word of corporations. It's not the word of materiality, of the questions of Facebooks and Instagram, of media, where we show what we are not. This the internal, intimate world in which is so unknown to all of us, refound, rediscovered, and we find ourselves. And once we find us, we find God. Because this law is etched in all of us, in our own consciousness. And slowly, we will convert ourselves in the man of goodwill that practice justice and love and charity in his own purity. As it's written on chapter 17, be perfect. Bringing to us in very sweet words this love that is like a rain throughout all of us into our hearts, and of those who can understand that sometimes the silence and resignation, the obedience to those laws brings to us, and it's necessary towards us so that other destructions would not be needed for other times. There is a message that from Humberto de Campos in Boa Nova, the Gospel, from Mary, that says, every time I read this message, the tears reach to my eyes. And there's no other way that I find from this message. And it says somewhat like this. It tells this Mary's story. It's at the end, when she's looking at Jesus in the cross, and at a certain moment of that, it says that Mary, in her last moments, Jesus showed up to her, and he came as a beggar, and he invites her to go into this new world of God as the queen chosen by the Christ, and we follow it, and we're gonna bring a few things from it that will to show to us that there is no other way in these moments of crisis and pain and affliction is to hear Jesus' love, Jesus' words, Jesus' voice, and Mary and good spirits that will nourish us and it will fulfill our hunger, this hunger of love. Many, this is from Mary. Mary already had passed away, and a angelic spirits were conducting her to higher levels of existence that we cannot even imagine. But at that moment, Mary was on her way with all those spirits going up, with spirits, pure spirits going up, and she brings the following consideration. Umberto de Campos brings us these considerations, which I'm going to try to read a few portions of it. Happiness was within her heart, and the spirits were going her, ready to go up, and then she remembered the disciples from Jesus throughout the world, and she decides to embrace those that were left behind, waiting for the clarities of the God of the kingdom of God, and she conducted all of them. So Mary, in a moment, she was going up, but she remembered those that were left behind, those who were suffering in the circles, and the first Christians. And in the moment of wanting to go back, help them. And she just emitted that thought, and she moved these angels that were with her, those spirits that were with her, and they came to guide her where she wanted to go. In a few moments, she was looking at a huge city, a huge city, the marble in marble, and throughout the streets were in a constant movement, fulfilled with richness, with slaves. In a few moments, she went to see another crowd which were locked up, and she walked into those dungeons in which hundreds of faces in suffering reflected their suffering, faces reflected their suffering. And they experienced at that moment consolation within their hearts. Mary connected to each one of them and felt their fears, and she prayed for them with full of suffering and trust, and she felt she was the mother of all of them, those tortured for the injustice of the world. She spread that love and clarity throughout all of them. They were old men that would trust Jesus, women that would had departed towards him, and youngsters that came to all of them and deposited in the gospel of Jesus all their hopes. And Mary touched all their hearts before she departed, and she really wanted to tell them, leave them something that she would give to all of them. What would she have to give to them? She would ask God to free them. That's what she asked. And she thinks Jesus would tell us that with all of them, all the suffering is very light, and it was necessary to be, it was more interesting to be a slave with Jesus than false freedom in the world. And you would to remember that the Jesus left the energy of the prayer as the tool, and she prayed to the heavens that she would feel that the would leave to the Christians at the time. strength of the happiness. And she gets close to one of the girls that were there, which were very suffered, and she would tell her to this woman, sing, my daughter, Gerard, have goodwill, have good animals, convert our suffering on earth, on happiness to the heavens. And the prisoner would never understand why she wanted to, her, her heart would go up, and that woman that would look up to the sky and locked up behind bars, not understanding the understanding of her happiness. And she will sing towards love of Jesus, thanking her gratitude for the pains that were given to her, converting all of her suffering in jubilous rhymes towards hope and happiness. And in this moment, that small woman connected to Mary would followed up by hundreds of voices waiting for their death. And in this moment, these first Christians walk into the circus and they die with their hearts fulfilled with hope that we envy. We are still in the process of constructing those strength in ourselves of this love that's more than necessary this moment in which we are going through, so that we can constitute in ourselves the strength and the energy and the happiness of being alive in spite of the difficulties. The suffering and the pain is a blessing sometimes in which we go through, because it teaches us how to live in a more Christic way, in a more fraternal way, thinking about our next, and we think about ourselves in this process, in which this duty towards the creature, the beauty in ourselves and the others, we can establish among ourselves in this small amount of time which we go through, the basis in the world completely different. And this moment, we really, in happiness, in jubilance, we can not only listen to Mary's voice, but throughout all of those spirits who tells us every day, in which we stop to pray, in which we meditate, have good animals, have goodwill, go forward with happiness, because as Mary said, this too will pass, shall pass. That Jesus be with us in this moments in which we go through the difficulty, and one way or another, may we nourish ourselves of this love that's always available to us for all the human beings throughout the entire planet since the beginning of time. May Jesus be with us and bless us. Peace to all of us, and thank you so much.